afternoon to all of you joining us here from Europe. Good morning and good evening to those of you in other parts of the world. From wherever you are joining us, it's a very warm welcome to you all to this online event on the nexus between conflict and climate change. My name is Rebecca Ritters. I'm a news anchor and reporter for DW News here in Berlin. And on behalf of the Berghof Foundation and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, I'm delighted to be guiding you through, hopefully smoothly, through today's discussion. It is, of course, unfortunate that we're not able to all be together in one room today, but such are our times at the moment, unfortunately. The online nature of this event, however, offers us the opportunity to invite people who may not otherwise be able to join us here in Berlin, both from the panel side and also from the audience, and that is a definite plus. So welcome, everybody. It is now widely accepted that climate change will have, and is indeed already having, a huge impact on conflict and the peacebuilding process. If I can borrow the words of Sir David Attenborough, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, and many others speaking at the UN Security Council meeting on Tuesday, climate change is the biggest threat to security faced in our time. It's no longer a question of if, but a question of what. What are we going to do about it? Our understanding of the nexus between these two paradigms is still in its infancy, and the goal of this event is to propel that conversation from merely stating facts to taking action. Climate change is a predicted disaster, and it's happening in slow motion, and it's never been more relevant to the current policy decision-making agenda. In many countries, we're already seeing that climate change-related disasters increase the risk of armed conflicts. And the question is how we can better integrate the peacebuilding and climate change communities to provide better outcomes and also better solutions. Today, we'll be focusing on 3 countries in conflict. They're all hit by climate change, but in different ways. There's Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and Syria. First, we'll hear from experts on these regions from the Berghof and the Potsdam Institute, as well as other NGOs, and they'll introduce each region and the issues most affecting them. That will bring us to the main panel event. We have a great lineup of speakers today, and I look forward to introducing them to you shortly. It should be a robust and thought-provoking conversation. Now, of course, last but not least, we're very eager to have your engagement, and there will be a Q&A session as part of this event. So please post your questions in the Q&A chat function on the side of your screen there, and we will try to get as many of those questions to our panel. Given time constraints, unfortunately, we no doubt will not be able to get to all of them, but we will collate them and give them to our hosts at a later date for reflection. And we urge you to continue this discussion even after this program has finished, in whichever way you can. A few things on administration. Sorry, it's boring, but I have to do it. I'll ask all our panel speakers to politely stick to the allotted time so that we can hopefully get through what is a very full program in good time today. I have been instructed to be a rather strict timekeeper, and I will be taking up that role if needed. I also want to take this time to let our audience know that I'll be introducing each speaker with a short title, but the full profile and the full bio of each of the speakers will be pasted into that chat window, so you can reference that if at your leisure. Now, before we move on to the opening remarks, I would like to congratulate the Berghof Foundation on 50 successful years of conflict transformation, and remind everyone that this is only the second of what looks to be a very jam-packed year of major events that they're hosting for this important anniversary. So if you're not already, we urge you to sign up to the mailing list so that you can be notified of future discussions such as this one. And fingers crossed, some of them will be in real life as well. Now, for the opening remarks, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Ottmar Edenhofer, Director and Chief Economist of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Professor Edenhofer, over to you.
Thank you very much. It is an enormous pleasure to open this very important event together with the Berghof Foundation to advance the debate from stating the facts to taking action based on evidence-based policy advice. Now, over the past decade, the nexus of climate change and human security has received a growing attention from policy actors as well as from the scientific community. Several influential publications highlight that there is already a discernible link between extreme weather events, conflict genesis, but the underlying mechanisms are not yet understood. At the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research, we have invested over the last 3 years significantly, not only to get a better understanding of extreme weather events, but also to get a better understanding of the impacts of extreme weather events on ethnic conflicts. Researchers already show that ethnically polarized and agriculturally dependent countries are especially at risk of experience conflicts after extreme hydroclimatic events, such as prolonged drought. But the context matters. The context matters, and effective governance of the commons can prevent or mediate conflicts. And this is very important for us to get an understanding what kind of options are at hand for decision makers in the regions. To gain a better understanding of the complex climate security nexus and to identify possible intervention points for the conflict resolution, the Potsdam Institute is conducting research on a global scale, but also investigates context-specific conflict escalation and possible climate drivers. Currently, we are carrying out several projects on climate security, including the CLIMSEC Sahel project, Green Vision Central Asia project, the Global Risk and Foresight Assessment on the security implication of climate change, which are supported by the German Foreign Office. Moreover, it is very important to us that we don't want to convey the messages within the academic and the scientific community. We want to intensify our partnership with other research institutions, civil society organizations, focusing on peace and security. The climate crisis has increasingly become a topic for peace and security practitioners, but many organizations do not know how to integrate climate security risks into their assessment and operations. And for this reason, we are hosting today's discussion together with the Berghof Foundation. We hope that through insights from 3 countries where climate change has already resulted in severe pressure on livelihoods, namely Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and Syria, we can arrive at some practical ways forward for research, policy, and practice. I wish you a very fruitful debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ottmar-Edenhofer. Let's turn now to Andrew Gilmore, the Executive Director of the Berghof Foundation, who will add his opening remarks. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca and Dr. Edenhofer. We are delighted that the Potsdam Institute has partnered us in this event today. PIC is one of the leading organizations in the world for climate change research. And as Rebecca said, 2021 is the 50th anniversary of the Berghof Foundation, an organization that's been on the front line of many conflicts. And it's appropriate that one of our first events to commemorate this milestone should be on today's topic, which is a new priority for Berghof in our second half century. And a very big welcome to all speakers and all the audience. Understanding the link between climate change and conflict is a relatively new concept. And I remember back in 2007, working in the office of the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, who on one occasion publicly made a remark that climate change, as manifested by drought and therefore farmer-herdsman tensions, was a contributory cause of the fighting and the mass suffering in Darfur, which was then raging. And he was blasted and excoriated for that comment and accused of somehow justifying the genocidal acts of the Janjaweed and the Khartoum government, which of course he wasn't doing at all. And at least we have moved on from that point. And at least in our worlds, that is, both the worlds represented here, the peacemaking and mediation world, and indeed the scientific climate world. In both of those, the links between climate and conflict are not seriously contested. We're going to hear a lot about those links in the next 2 hours, but my hope is that we will also get beyond merely establishing and restating those links, and to start a discussion, especially when it comes to the panel after hearing about the three countries, about what we can actually do about those links. It's vital for us all to get beyond our immediate circles and bubbles and to work with new partners, audiences, and communities. And that's why I'm so pleased that we have PIC's formidable scientific expertise on display today. And our joint aim is to see how the climate community can better work with a peace lens, and how the peace building community can better work with a climate lens, to the mutual benefit of both, I hardly need add. Now, it's not my job to introduce the panelists and speakers today, but I do want to say how pleased we are to have them all. And just a quick word to welcome Staffan de Mistura, who, as the senior UN representative in both Syria and Afghanistan, his last two jobs, as well as having previously served in Ethiopia, he is uniquely placed to give a perspective on the implications of climate change on peace and security. Now, he and I, and indeed another panelist of today, Michael Keating, we all met each other 32 years ago working in Afghanistan, which was the year the Soviets pulled out of that country after destroying large parts of it. And of course, had anyone told us back then, even though coincidentally we were all three committed environmentalists, that 3 decades later we would be coming together to discuss climate change as a contributory cause of the conflict that was still raging in Afghanistan, I fear we may have reacted in polite disbelief. But it's an undeniable fact of the world we now live in. And the real question, in addition to showing how climate change is likely to become an even more major factor in future conflict patterns in Afghanistan, Syria, and Ethiopia, is what we all need to do about it. So I'm greatly looking forward to hearing suggestions on this from all speakers. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. Both of our speakers there, thank you. As I mentioned, and as Andrew also just mentioned, we'll be focusing on 3 key regions today: Afghanistan, Syria, and Ethiopia. These countries have a long history of ethnic and other tensions, as well as varying degrees of armed conflict. Now, that's not to say that conflicts in these regions have been started by the climate crisis, but it is without a doubt that the changing climate will, and in some cases may have already impacted the nature of the conflicts in these countries. So to kick off the regional input portion, I'll introduce the speakers on Afghanistan. Don't forget, the full bios will be posted in the chat for your reference. So first, I'd like to invite Stephanie Vesh. She's a doctoral researcher at the Potsdam Institute, working on the Greater MENA region and the Sahel. We also have Basir Fida. He leads the Afghanistan unit at the Berghof Foundation. He worked extensively in Kabul with the German embassy and the UN, and as a principal liaison officer to the current president of Afghanistan, Dr. Ashraf Ghani. And thirdly, we have Dr. Martina Klimes. She works as an advisor for water and peace at the Stockholm International Water Institute and advises on transboundary basins affected by water scarcity, political tensions, and armed violence. To the three of you, Stephanie, I believe you're first. You have the floor.
Just bear with me for a second while I set up my presentation. All right, can everybody see my presentation? Perfect. Okay. Just 1 second, okay. Well, we have the pleasure of having a very diverse audience here today, and I will try and do my best to do it justice. Our presentations today do not try to imply that climate change is the sole cause of conflict, or even one of the most prominent causes of conflict. We will merely try to make a point that climate change exacerbates existing drivers of conflict. We will, 1, examine some of the scientific evidence, 2, consider already observable impacts of climate change. We will look at potential conflict pathways in the Afghan context. 4, we will address future projections regarding climate change impacts. And finally, and 5th, we will propose measures to address the threat. Now, more scientific studies are finding that the risk for armed conflict is increased in the context of climate change under certain conditions. Studies have found that high agricultural dependence, a high level of ethnic factionalization, and weak governance make the potential for climate conflict or for conflict under high exposure to climate change greater. The latter factor, of course, has large implications for adaptive capacities and the potential to foster resilience with respect to climate change impacts and also armed conflict impacts. The Afghan population is highly dependent on agricultural activities for their livelihoods, as it provides a source of income for 60% of the population. The role of rain-fed agriculture is crucial as it directly depends on precipitation and variability thereof. For the purpose of irrigation, river streams are the dominant source, and the agricultural sector is the government's main focus concerning efforts for economic recovery. In terms of ethnic fractionalization, Afghanistan ranks among the most ethnically diverse, as is evident from the map to the left. For reference to the right, we can see a map of ethnic distribution across Afghanistan. This, of course, is very simplistic as there is in general, a lot of mixture within the regions. Due to decades of armed conflict, governance structures are weak. Afghanistan ranks in the 0 to 10th percentile, taking into account the World Bank's 6 indicators of governance, which are listed here. So indeed, Afghanistan does check all the boxes that make climate change a threat to national security and may thus lead to prolongation of the ongoing conflict. If we examine the development of temperature within Afghanistan until today, we note that it is already warming at a level that is greater than the global average. The global average is currently at around 1 Celsius, while Afghanistan's mean annual temperature has already risen to 1.8 degrees. Due to the topography and the corresponding different climatic zones, which are exhibited on the right-hand corner map, the distribution of warming across the country is very uneven. This photo was taken during the 2010 flood. Broken levees had caused widespread destruction of crops, livestock, homes, and vital infrastructure. Last year was also a year of great flooding for Afghanistan. While single event attribution to climate change is still something that scientists are working on, we do know that under global warming, extreme weather events such as droughts and floods are set to become more common occurrences. Researchers have found that of the 30 Wakhan corridor glaciers, 28 had retreated. The satellite image to the right shows example of glacial retreat observed between the 1970s and the 2000s in the Wakhan Pamir. Glacial melt provides fresh water for agricultural activities, drinking, and hygiene for many communities. So fluctuation therein greatly affect them. Increased snow and glacial melt in the spring causes flash floods and can have a negative effect on dry season flow as well. I will now address examples of pathways for conflict under climate change. By no means will this be an exhaustive list. I will address 3 levels of conflict: the intercommunal, the asymmetric, as well as the interstate level. I will introduce a more concrete example for each level. While conflict of land has a long history in Afghanistan, whether that is outsiders coming in or between communities, increased resource scarcity caused by climate change will surely create additional tensions between and among communities. Mobilization among ethnic cleavages is especially salient when ethnicity also corresponds to different livelihood strategies in a shared space. In addition to the resource conflict and land and water conflicts and grazing rights, Afghanistan will face population pressure. Here, diminishing resources meets a significant rate of population growth and a returning group of displaced community. It is no news that poppy has been cultivated and utilized as a source of income, among others, by armed non-state actors. It is highly profitable, which makes it attractive for cultivation. It will also do better than other crops under climate change due to its high tolerance to drought conditions. When other crops may increasingly fail, poppy might become more attractive for cultivators. This may result in further destabilization of the country and the greater region due to sustained asymmetric warfare, in addition to increased mobilization. The map shows Central Asia here, with the major shared river catchments, the Amu Darya and the Syr Darya. Developments regarding transboundary water cooperation are promising and leading in a positive direction. This is certainly necessary in light of future projections regarding freshwater availability within the region. Upstream countries are interested in expansion of hydropower through the building of dams. This can affect downstream flow, which desperately needed downstream economies that are reliant on water-intensive cash crops such as cotton. Furthermore, while providing renewable energy, dams indeed increase the evaporation rate due to greater water surface exposure. The map on the left here in this slide depicts an increasing occurrence of drought in a low emission scenario, while map number 2 depicts an even more worrying high emission scenario. While there is still some disagreement between different models projecting precipitation, there is confidence in increased drought scenarios due to an increase in evapotranspiration due to higher temperatures in Afghanistan. Even under low emission scenario, reduced snowfall is expected. An increase in glacial melt will further elevate risk of springtime floods. High season flow will be adversely affect, limiting access to fresh water. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported that the Hindu Kush Himalaya region is at risk of losing more than 60% of its glaciers by 2100. Wheat is the most widely cultivated crop in the region. The Turn Down the Heat report states that for the South Asia region, in which Afghanistan is included for the purpose of the study, wheat yields could decrease by 1.3% annually. Animal health and herder livelihoods would also be negatively affected. This has severe consequences for food security and health. Increased risk of child stunting just being one of the many outcomes of food insecurity. Now, what do we do with all of this information? There are 3 components that can form part of a holistic solution: research, climate change adaptation, and environmental peace building. In January, a meteorological station was inaugurated by the University of Kandahar and the Green Central Asia Initiative. Having reliable data in order to assess observable as well as projected climate change is key. Reliable data is currently still hard to come by, and we must make an effort to accelerate data gathering and improve the quality of data. We can then address research gaps related to the climate change conflict nexus, such as context-specific pathways, interactions between conflict drivers and climate change, as well as potential feedback loops. Adaptive capacity is inextricably linked to strengthening governance. Knowledge dissemination, which does take into account local traditional knowledge, is key. This is also related to improved resource management. Some level of resource scarcity can be addressed by improving the management thereof. This could refer to leaky pipes or coming up with regional cooperative strategies with neighboring countries in order to avoid antagonist sentiment. And finally, adaptation measures must be undertaken. Examples of this are water harvesting, levee building with future climate impacts in mind, improved food storage, weather index insurance, expansion of irrigation techniques, improved infrastructure and demarcation of routes for nomadic pastoralists, just to name a few. And finally, environmental peace building can help address intercommunal tensions related to resource scarcity. Actions may include identification of areas for improvement of resource management at state level as well as the household level, identifying diverging livelihood interests for groups starting some sharing the same space, and capacity building for alternative forms of income where possible. And of course, supporting traditional livelihoods that are interwoven with group identities. So yes, in closing, Afghanistan is highly vulnerable to the climate change conflict nexus, and current and even more aggressively projected climate change impacts may create conditions that protract armed conflict in the country. Research, increasing adaptive capacity and implementation, as well as utilizing strategies of environmental peace building can be points of intervention. There are many, many more points I would like to make, but unfortunately we're out of time, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie Vesh. Fascinating. We look forward to picking up on some of those things in our panel discussion, some of those points that you brought up. I'll now hand it over to Bassir Fida. His profile will once again be in the chat window for you. Bassir, take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Stephanie, for this really extensive presentation. I'm only going to come more from a peace-building perspective, I hope. I want to make a few points to discuss what we just heard. I mean, first, granted that there is not, strictly speaking, from a scientific point of view, a direct correlation between climate change and level of conflict, at least not yet that we have understood, as we heard, but that climate change can significantly exacerbate the risks of conflict by negatively affecting the well-known and well-established drivers of conflict. This, of course, cannot be denied as a viable proposition. We heard from Stephanie about the pathways through which climate change can act as a multiplier and catalyst of conflict in Afghanistan, especially in this kind of a fragile context, which is particularly, of course, vulnerable precisely because all those conditions that she mentioned are present. And these are the conditions under which climate change can facilitate these very drivers of conflict that we know for many years now. One of those conditions is particularly important because it is consequential for dealing with the other conditions, and that is this potential emerging vicious cycle of conflict and climate change. The Afghan war for decades has led to severe lack of governance capacities. In some parts of the country, there's hardly any governance structure in place. And without effective governance capacities in place, this country cannot envision, let alone implement workable adaptation strategies. There's a reason why data cannot be collected, or at least reliable data. And without the needed stability, those capacities are just simply not possible to generate. Without which, of course, climate change will no doubt lead to more conflicts over resources. I have grown up in Afghanistan and have firsthand experienced the intra and inter-community and tribe conflicts over water management for agriculture and grazing rights for animals, some of the things that Stephanie mentioned. This has unfortunately been part of life in that country for years. It is only bound to further deteriorate in light of shrinking resources for livelihood as a result of the implications of climate change. My second but related point is the drug economy, which Stephanie alluded to. There are now more than enough studies and reports that establish a clear-cut link between the drug economy and the prevailing instability due to the ongoing war in Afghanistan. This illicit economy has led to the creation of entrenched and really high-stake economic incentives. As we saw in the presentation, the contribution of the drug economy to the GDP is enormous. The cultivation of poppy, this drought-resistant crop, may just increase even further. At the least, the current level of cultivation will continue to remain highly resilient to any intervention. Afghanistan is already a country that by most estimates supplies 90% of heroin in demand within the global market. I would like to highlight a somewhat different aspect of the problem than what Stephanie laid out in her presentation. The deeply entrenched economic incentives have already led to the emergence of an extremely dangerous and powerful criminal network. This network is, by all credible accounts, made up of powerful members on all sides of the ongoing conflict. This network will most certainly serve as a potent force to reckon with in Afghanistan's effort to end the ongoing war. I'm talking about what we call in our peace-building lingo, the spoilers. The network will do everything it can to protect its interests. These interests are best served, of course, in a context of instability and weak governance and state structures. My third point relates to the transboundary water issues. Since I believe the next presenter will cover this topic somewhat more in depth, I will only make a quick point here from a regional dynamics perspective. The Kamal Khan Dam was celebrated in Afghanistan, but has raised serious concerns in Iran. Other water harnessing work, Shatut and others, for instance, can very realistically lead to problems with Pakistan. If this issue is not addressed within the framework of a structured dialogue with Afghanistan's neighbors, we might see yet another transformation of the Afghan conflict. We know that some of the countries of the region are already playing a rather unhelpful role in the ongoing intra-Afghan war. We can't rule out the possibility of more direct confrontations and potential for violence, which could transform this conflict from its internal dimension to yet another regional dimension. My fourth point is directed at Afghanistan's international partners, particularly countries, of course, with advanced and well-established economies. Those countries both have a moral responsibility, but also self-interest vis-a-vis helping Afghanistan to build a sustainable livelihood infrastructure adapted to climate change and support Afghanistan's ongoing efforts to end this protracted conflict. Moral responsibility, because Afghanistan is by no established measure a significant contributor to anthropogenic climate change itself. Yet it has to bear the consequences of those greenhouse gas emissions caused by others who have greatly benefited from it. But in addition to that, there is a self-interest which cannot be ignored. I'm not very optimistic about European countries and others, for that matter, dealing very well with yet another significant wave of migration. We already saw and continue to see a rather ugly side of humanity as a result of a few 100,000 of people who came knocking on other countries' doors, including Europe, people fleeing for their life. As for actors like Berghof, we need to integrate climate change in our thinking and in our work. In those very difficult contexts like Afghanistan, climate change sensitive peace building is an inevitability if we are to succeed in helping our partners in those difficult contexts. Finally, my appeal to the conflicting parties in Afghanistan, whether you like it or not, you need to deal with the implications of climate change. It will only get worse. Don't wait for a calamity to hit. Get ahead of it. It doesn't matter who in the end will get to rule the country. I'm sure nobody wants to rule over mere graveyards. Make the potential horrible consequences of climate change a silver lining. Put your differences aside and come together for a better future. One of peaceful coexistence and readiness to deal with the extreme challenges ahead. Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the chance to speak to you today.
Rebecca, you're on mute.
Thank you, Basir. Apologies for the technical error there. My camera's now on, my microphone's now on. Dr. Martina Klimes, I'd like to invite you as a third speaker on Afghanistan. You have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you, Stephanie and Basir. Very interesting presentations, very interesting reflections. I would like to focus my contribution on something that's positive. I would like to share with you what, in my view, is actually working and what needs to be supported. So the first thing we did hear about the difficulties, immense difficulties on the communal levels, in the different provinces. But comparing to other countries, what we see is working rather well is internal coordination between different ministries in Afghanistan. President Ghani showed strong political will for supporting transboundary water dialogues and work with water in general, which was really not the case before. And we see this strong political will manifested in a lot of bilateral agreements between Afghanistan and their Central Asian neighbors. There is a strong focus of Afghanistan on finding viable opportunities for tangible cooperative results with countries in Central Asia, because this is where we can make some progress. So we have, Afghanistan has, for example, signed the Memorandum of Understanding with Tajikistan, with Turkmenistan, has an ongoing water dialogue with Uzbekistan, and progress has also been made in the dialogue with Iran. And why these dialogues are fairly successful in comparison to other similar parts of the world is really because there is a very well-functioning internal coordination between the different bodies representing foreign policy, security, and then the technical aspect. And I fully understand that we still do need to continue working on the internal capacity, and that needs to really be developed also on the municipal level. But we do see some progress and some positivity on the internal level. This Transboundary Water Commission has been established in 2012, and it really did progress quite well. And it really, we see that the negotiators who are contributing to these dialogues are both from the foreign affairs, but also representing the technical side. The truth is, yes, we definitely need more data. We also need more tailored capacity support for data gathering, data analysis, because if we negotiate about something, we really need to understand what we are negotiating about. We need to understand future water availability and future water needs of the country. So this is a message for the international community on something very tangible, what is possible to support. Of course, this is difficult in a context of ongoing armed conflicts and other dynamics, but I do want to say that progress has been made on some parts. Especially now, the dialogue with Uzbekistan is very encouraging because the countries have been able to identify tangible benefits for cooperation. It's been mentioned that also there's been progress with Iran. As you know, that Afghanistan actually has a treaty from 1973 on Helmand River. And then the country maintains dialogue. The commissioners are meeting. And there's been recently an agreement that the two countries will actually start a joint technical commission studying the situation on the river, as well as looking into the situation on the Hari River that is shared between two countries. And that we do see willingness to at least continue the dialogue, which is very positive. Also, the change in the US administration and possible change in the US-Iran relations may help also to create more enabling environment for this type of dialogues. Why are these transboundary dialogues so important? Because if they are successful, and if we do have a possible future cooperation, that will also help internal development in Afghanistan and development of internal infrastructure. You may all know about the devastating droughts also in 2018, which led to, I believe it was 250,000 people who were displaced. Many of them moved to cities. And what we see in Afghanistan, cities are actually running out of drinking water. There is a big issue in Kabul. We see that the groundwater levels are nearly depleted. And then should this trend continue, should we see more people from the rural areas moving to cities when we have a shocking lack of drinking water, that would actually exacerbate conflicts on that level as well. So this is something that also does need attention. And what Afghanistan definitely needs is the continuous support of international community, but here it's really tailored support. There is an opportunity definitely for international actors to contribute to these transboundary dialogues, but it is important to really ask what is needed, what kind of support is welcomed, what kind of support is needed by both parties, and provide exactly that kind of support. And I think I see that I'm running out of time. I did actually set up alarm. And I would do, following the two presentations, I would like to end that there is a hope. There's a lot of very important work done. There's a lot of very dedicated Afghan government officials who work at different ministries, who really represent Afghanistan immensely well in international forum, and who really do their utmost to find solutions to this crisis. So what the international community can do is really to support them in the best way they can, and really respect the local knowledge that's already there, because these people have been negotiating these agreements for quite a long time. And then they do know what they need. So I'm looking forward to hearing about the other two case studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martina Klimas. Very good idea to set an alarm. I urge all other speakers to do the same thing. Very fascinating. I appreciate all three of you for that discussion on Afghanistan. We look forward to putting some of the issues that were raised there to our panelists shortly. Now we move from Afghanistan to the African continent to look at issues facing Ethiopia specifically, and I'll invite Julia Blocher. She's a doctoral researcher at the Potsdam Institute. I might wait to introduce the second speaker after her. So Julia, you have the floor. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
We do, yes. Go ahead.
Okay, wonderful. So I will just share my screen if that's okay. Is it working? I believe so, yes?
It is, yes, we can see that. Thanks, Julie.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for the introduction. And of course, thanks also to the Berghof Foundation for hosting this event and inviting me to speak on the panel today. I'm going to talk about climate change and conflict pathways in Ethiopia with a bit of a focus on local conflicts, and then I'll look at an outlook for future under different climate change scenarios. So basically, I'm going to talk about, sorry, okay, it's more important. I'm going to discuss 3 points today. First, we're going to look at the main climate conflict pathways that are of relevance to Ethiopia and a quick case study based on our recent research. Then we'll look at the climate change scenarios for the future. And then finally, we'll discuss some good practices for climate smart development and climate proof peace building. So there are 3 main climate conflict pathways I wanted to raise today in reference to Ethiopia, although there are, of course, others that one could discuss. I think these are those that we have the greatest amount of evidence about and are really looking at how climate change may lead to local conflicts in Ethiopia. So I won't spend time today talking about the role of climate change in potentially exacerbating interstate conflict and leading to regional conflict, although there are certainly resources out there that one could point to on this topic. And in particular, of all of these climate conflict pathways in Ethiopia, and I'm going to talk about each one in further detail, displacement of people, so meaning forced migration of people, as well as the recruitment of some people into non-state armed groups can have spillover effects and contribute to regional and international conflicts. So coming back to these climate conflict pathways, the first one is really how in an agrarian and developing country such as Ethiopia, many people who are not integrated into formal credit markets and are very likely to lack any type of social safety net or insurance mechanism in the case of, for example, crop failure or inability to raise livestock on this increasingly hot and dry land. These dynamics lead to food and livelihood insecurity, which can in some cases lead to essentially desperation and misery of people who can no longer rely on their traditional livelihood mechanisms and traditional coping strategies. So in some cases, people then rely on negative coping strategies or what we may otherwise call maladaptation. For example, we've seen evidence of forced child marriage. We've seen evidence of so-called survival sex of women who are lacking positive coping strategies. And we also have seen evidence of the increased recruitment of people into non-state armed groups in the region. And we attribute this to the costs of joining such non-state armed groups as being relatively lower when alternative livelihoods are not available. So in other words, the attractiveness of these non-state armed groups can increase under desperate conditions exacerbated by climate change. Secondly, we see that there's a possibility of weakened institutions and unplanned urbanization contributing to unrest within Ethiopia. And there's really 2 main points at play here. So first, that climate change may weaken government institutions overall, not least by affecting the agricultural economy as is the case in Ethiopia, but also through affecting the government's ability to draw tax revenue from the population. Secondly, we see that climate change, which can have an impact on migration push factors, and we have already seen this in the case of Ethiopia in a number of contexts and circumstances, and that migration of people from especially urban areas towards cities can lead to discontent of the migrant as well as people already living in the urban areas, as those migrants may not be prepared to integrate the urban labor market, and this leads to discontent. So, and also we know that unmanaged migration can lead to vulnerability to hazards in urban areas, potentially leading to disasters and displacement. In addition to this, we know that food price shocks and unemployment that exist in cities can be exacerbated by climate change impacts and leading to civil unrest of people living in urban areas, especially urban elites. And this is very much a reality today, as we've already seen protests related to food price shocks in Ethiopia notably in 2007, 2008, and 2016. So this is not a hypothetical situation, but something that climate change is likely to exacerbate. The third climate conflict pathway to highlight today, and one that I think is what we're most interested in our current research, is that competition over scarcer and scarcer natural resources can actually create tensions between groups and lead to flare-ups between different types of land users. So as we see this scarcification of resources and the decrease of local people to be able to use farmlands as well as pasture lands, there's increasing competition between groups, and these flare-up of tensions tend to occur at the interfaces between physical and intangible boundaries between people and between communities. So we see especially conflicts occurring at water points, for example. And the reason for this really is because the changing quality and availability of natural resources, which is affected by climate change, forces these groups to come together in increasing frequency, also forces them to renegotiate control over natural resources and land resources. So we have evidence that these dynamics leads to tensions at the local level, and we actually have more evidence that there's a role of climate change in deepening existing fault lines rather than necessarily creating new ones. So this deepening of intercommunal grievances really takes a unique character in Ethiopia because of the current regional boundaries in the country that are based on ethnic, cultural, and linguistic lines. So this is something sometimes referred to as ethnic regionalization, and has been linked to deepening grievances between different groups in the country. So just to give a quick concrete example of this last pathway, based on a case study research that we conducted in Ethiopia. So essentially we investigated the role of climate change in the persistent low-level conflict between the Borana and Gari groups in southeastern Ethiopia. There's unfortunately been a number of flare-ups of conflict that has occurred, especially since 2000. And we discussed with a number of experts in Ethiopia about this, and they attributed these conflicts to increasing resource scarcity and historical grievances between these two groups, which over time developed into a culture of reprisals and built resentment over many, many years. We saw in particular after persistent drought between 2015 and 2017, the tensions really boiled over in 2017 in Moyale, in a border town, during which the Gari people were evicted from the Oromia side of the town, while the Borana people were also evicted from the Somali war areas of this town. So this is a continuing low-level conflict that occasionally flares up, and in particular in the aftermath of drought events. And we also have noted that this is a similar trend to the experience in the northern part of the country, where Isa Somali people are at times perceived as intruders in the Afar territories. So now that we have looked at the history and current dynamics of these climate conflict pathways in Ethiopia, I think we can also look at the projections of future climate change to really inform strategic planning and especially government programs with the help of their partners. So what I'm going to present is based on recent work published by PIC, for which you see the reference at the bottom of the screen. And I'll focus on temperature and precipitation extremes, as these are really the most relevant points for the day-to-day decisions of farmers and pastoralists, as well as decision makers hoping to help those groups. what we know is that the mean annual temperature in the country has increased already by 1.3 degrees Celsius since 1960. And we can project a further increase of between 1.8 and 4.6 degrees Celsius, depending on the scenario chosen by the end of the century. And this overall temperature increase will be more or less uniform across the country. So although the mean temperature increase would be more or less uniform, there would be regional variations in the increase in hot days. We see a number of very hot days and tropical nights increasing over the country, but more intense in the lowlands and southeastern parts of the country, which are also the pastoral areas. And this is a problem given that pastoral livelihoods are particularly sensitive to climatic changes. And so this increase in extreme temperature days is likely to have severe consequences for people living in those regions. And moreover, while the climate models don't agree on the general direction of precipitation in Ethiopia, we can say with a high level of certainty that we'll see heavier rainfall events concentrated over fewer days, and perhaps combined with a shortening of the key rainy season, which is of course the most important for planting decisions and for agricultural livelihoods. So heavier precipitation over fewer days has a number of negative consequences for crop productivity, in particular that heavy rainfall damages crops, and shortening of the rainy season, or even a shifting of the rainy season, can negatively affect planting decisions. And finally, I wanted to discuss some good practices to minimize climate fragility risks, but I hope that this can also be picked up by the discussants. And the good news is that the government of Ethiopia already has a number of such programs underway to climate-proof the development process. And these four main ways to do this, for example, to develop climate change adaptation solutions that are conflict sensitive. We already see the relative success of the productive safety net program, which among other things, is a food for work program for vulnerable peoples. There's a number of ways in which we can scale up opportunities for peace building to support climate resilience at the local level, as well as at the national level, and perhaps even at the regional level. One can look into climate sensitive strategic planning at the highest levels in order to reduce conflict risks. And finally, it's important, of course, to enhance regional cooperation on climate security, as well as to enhance the ability of the region to develop early warning systems for climate effects, as well as early warning systems for conflict. And some of these programs are already underway through the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, to which Ethiopia is a member. So I will stop there and look forward to a further discussion on these topics. Thank you so much.
Julia, thank you very much for that detailed report on Ethiopia. We'll definitely be picking up on some of those points, particularly that climate proofing the development process later in the panel. I'd now like to invite Dr. Tigist Yeshiwas Engedor to continue. She's a senior peacebuilding advisor to the Minister of the Ethiopian Ministry of Peace. Once again, a reminder that full bio will be in the chat window. Thank you, Dr. Engedor.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Berghof, for the invitation. And thank you, Julia, for the very good presentation. It was very good and thorough research. Congratulations on that. So briefly, first of all, I would like to thank, obviously, Berghof. Obviously, the world is increasingly understands that climate change, conflicts, water wars, state collapse, lack of inclusion, lack of sustained democratic practices, lack of strong institutes, bad governance, are all issues of that deeply involve pastoralists and the people of Ethiopia, and obviously other parts of the world as well. As Julia rightly mentioned in her presentation, conflicts are mainly in Ethiopia, and her specific case related to natural resources is common in Ethiopia, especially the areas that she studied as a case study. Especially when there is drought, and now, of course, the increased heats in Ethiopia and elsewhere. The tension is fueled by different groups, obviously, because of decreasing food supplies and increasing, and also leads this to increasing migration and cut rates. And thirdly, climate change and development has a strong nexus. Can you hear me, Rebecca? Climate change.
Sorry,
and
yes, we can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you. Apologies, Maya, I was on mute. Continue.
Okay. So thirdly, my third point is climate change and development has a strong nexus. They are closely intertwined concepts, and obviously the poor are highly vulnerable, and they are affected, or they are highly affected by the impact. The link between environmental security and the security of nations is highly intertwined, like I said. So when there is low capacity to respond or to cope with damages, and this results obviously from climate-related and extreme events, and how environmental degradation contributes to competition over resources and then a river to violent conflicts due to lack of obviously alternative livelihoods or possibilities they migrate. So climate change should meet with strong policy. And the fourth point is obviously touched upon, strong institutes are very key. Strong institutes are greatly committed to elevation of natural resources, elevation of natural and man-made disasters, such as drought resilience and the resolution programs of conflicts that are rooted in climate change. So having that is very good. And the fifth point is there is a sort of general consensus among scientists and academics, practitioners, that climate change has become one of the most obviously formidable existential threats for human security. So the environment security, as you know, has three main characteristics: the physical environment and distribution and marginalization is the first one. And the second characteristic is access to inadequate resources due to rising population, and also pressure on non-renewable resources. That's also quite a challenge. And the third point is the environment security scenario degradation and misdistribution of resources, and also instability of regimes. All these contributed as three main characteristics of environmental security. So obviously, where there is poverty, like in the areas that you studied, there is widespread, there is widespread of poverty. People don't have emergency or withdrawal positions, and that's quite a challenge. And in your presentation, you showed us also that poverty resulting from different control of limited resources leads to conflict. If societies are environmentally insecure, they are all obviously prone to manipulate by conflict and armed struggle, and we need to work on that. Finally, I think environmental threat must be taken as peace and security imperative in Ethiopia. There are some good pipeline efforts that we mentioned, but obviously there is always room for improvement and lessons learned, and work on that. And secondly, policy issues of the environment need support at the local, the regional, and global level for their enforcement. As you mentioned, there are also some pipelines within IGAD. And third, the increase in temperature is high in Ethiopia as elsewhere. So there are also some good initiatives like the annual tree planting, which Ethiopia managed to plant 4 billion trees last year, where the number is contested. And the other one is decline in rainfall. Variability is quite a challenge. You also mentioned that. And I think impact studies also should consider the uncertainty of climate. And the other point is strong institutes and coordination is very vital. And finally, sound economic, sound environmental policies and strong institutes, strong and accountable governance, strong and accountable governance mechanisms has the potential to guarantee peace and security and environment nexus. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tigist Yeshivas, Engador, and Julia Blocher for that very interesting and detailed look at Ethiopia. And we're going to move to the last focus country or focus region that we're looking at today, and that is, of course, Syria. And to talk about Syria, I'd like to invite Dr. Colin P. Kelly. He's a senior research fellow at the Center for Climate and Security. Dr. Kelly, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Rebecca and the Berghof Foundation and the Potsdam Institute, and to the previous speakers. It's been a great discussion so far, and I think it's very important, and I'm happy to be contributing to this. I'll start out. I'm going to be giving some information about the Syria case study today. As we all know, arid and semi-arid regions and their agrarian societies are innately water stressed and therefore highly vulnerable. Populations are growing, increasing the demand for resources, particularly for water. Groundwater, vital for consumption, health, and irrigation purposes, is declining at an unsustainable rate in many places, largely due to overuse. When nations with high vulnerability experience climate or weather extremes or climate change, they can be pushed to or even beyond their respective thresholds of resilience. This has happened recently with disastrous consequences in Syria, leading to a refugee crisis and a bloody conflict. Here I will compare and contrast some modern studies and cases linking climate and migration, and discuss some more very recent evidence of compounding effects. In 2011, Syria collapsed into a prolonged large-scale conflict, as we all know. This occurred on the heels of 3 severe multi-year droughts in the 80s, in the 90s, and in the 2000s, the last of which, from 2007 to 2010, was the most severe multi-year drought episode in the observed record, and this obviously had a catalytic effect. In this case, the causal chain is pretty clear: existing acute vulnerability, water insecurity, agricultural collapse, and then a mass displacement of rural families to the urban areas. From a climate vulnerability perspective, the Syria case provides some prominent examples from which we can gain some valuable insights. Climate change can act as a threat multiplier to the security situation in the region by imposing additional pressures on already scarce resources, particularly groundwater, and by reinforcing pre-existing threats connected to migration following forced displacement. As mentioned before, it need not be the case that climatic factors alone were the cause or even the most prominent among the many factors that contributed to Syria's mass internal displacement leading up to the conflict. Rather, it was the combination of all factors that pushed Syria beyond its threshold of resilience. Globally, we're now witnessing the highest levels of forced displacement since World War II. An unprecedented over 80 million people around the world have been forced from home. Among them are 46 million internally displaced people. Many of these do not have access to education, healthcare, employment, or even freedom of movement. According to the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, Syrians, as of the end of 2019, continue to be the largest forcibly displaced population in the world, with more than 13 million people at the end of that last year. That's more than half of the Syrian total population. More than 6.6 million people have fled Syria, seeking safety in neighboring countries, Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and beyond. In Lebanon, where more than 1 million Syrian refugees reside, there are no formal refugee camps, and approximately 70% of Syrian refugees live below the poverty line. In Jordan, over 600,000 Syrian refugees are trapped in exile. Approximately 80% of them live outside camps, while many have found sanctuary in the refugee camps. 93% of these refugees live below the poverty line. In 2012, a briefer by the Center for Climate and Security in Washington, D.C., highlighted the possible connections between climate change, drought, natural resource mismanagement, and instability in Syria, drawing on important research released in 2011 by the National Ocean and Atmospheric Association in the US and the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. In 2015, my colleagues and I at Columbia University published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences entitled Climate Change in the Fertile Crescent and Implications of the Recent Syrian Drought. We set about to examine observed climate change in the region during the last century in the form of declining mean winter rainfall and rising surface temperatures, which combine to result in increasing aridification. State-of-the-art global climate models have successfully simulated these significant observed trends, which is not the case in all regions. And the models predict that the aridification is expected to not only continue, but to intensify in the coming decades, even under the more conservative radiative concentration pathways. In addition, we have observed an increase in the number and severity of multi-year droughts in recent decades, which is attributable to climate change. Naturally occurring droughts are becoming much more severe. In this figure, at the top panel, we show the average annual winter rainfall, which includes multi-year droughts, 3 or more consecutive years below the long-term normal, which are shaded in brown. And you can see that 3 of these events, as I mentioned before, have occurred quite recently. In the second panel from the top, we show the annual mean surface air temperature. And you can see that at the end of this record, every year was above the long-term normal. So basically moved into a new regime in terms of surface temperature, not just for Syria, but for this region. And this is what's occurring throughout many places in the Middle East. In the third panel is a Palmer Drought Severity Index, which combines precipitation and temperature to provide some idea about drought severity. And in the bottom shows the Syrian total population as a proxy for the demand for water. And you can see that in 1950, the Syrian population was on the order of 5 million and increased to nearly 25 million in recent years, even before the conflict. That placed a tremendous burden on the available resources. A more recent study by Cook et al. In 2015 concluded a, quote, very high likelihood that this recent drought in the Levant is drier than any comparable period over the last 900 years. This is strong evidence indicating that the recent drying is due to climate change rather than any form of low-frequency natural variability. Here, I show some maps on the top left of the region, and you can see the dark green is the average rainfall over this 70 to 80 year climatological period. And you can actually see where the Fertile Crescent gets its name. This is because of the rainfall that falls in eastern Turkey and in the northern Syria and in the west, where they've successfully grown agriculture for a long time. In the top right, over that same period, we show the linear trend, and you can see how widespread the drying is, the decline in rainfall during that period. In the bottom panels, we show on the left satellite indication of water at the surface and below the surface. In particular, the 2008 winter, which was extremely dry. It was the driest winter on record. And on the bottom right, normalized difference vegetation index. And you can see just how stressed the vegetation was during that same year. So this is a widespread feature throughout this region. One of the things that we hope to do is to be able to use the observations and the models and to be able to see how these really severe multi-year drought episodes change in the presence of climate change. And what we found was that when you include the climate change signal, you have a 2 to 3 times more likelihood to get these very severe multi-year drought events. In addition to the effects of climate change and multi-year droughts in Syria, another critical example of the adverse impacts of climate and/or weather extremes is the very recent flood events from Idlib to Aleppo, which occurred 1 month ago amidst heightened vulnerability in displacement camps. These increases in extremes are expected under current and future climate change. According to the Swiss NGO Care International, harsh weather conditions have caused more hardship and suffering for more than 1.5 million displaced people in northwest Syria, as more than 20,000 displaced people have lost their temporary homes as heavy rains, flooding, and snow damaged and destroyed over 4,000 tents at displacement camps there. The storm has turned camps into lakes in some 87 sites for displaced people in this region, causing loss of the only belongings people have left after years of conflict. Without heating, blankets, and dry mattresses to sleep on, many had to seek shelter with family members in public buildings or out in the open as temperatures dropped below zero. CARE's country director in Turkey, said that displacement has yet again caused misery for thousands of vulnerable populations in the Northwest. With winter setting in, rain and flooding has destroyed the homes of tens of thousands of people who have already been displaced. They have inadequate shelter. We see increasing hunger for the displaced Syrians. Humanitarian organizations are trying to provide emergency relief, but reaching those in need has been compounded by the flooding of access roads. There's also concern that the situation might contribute to the rise in COVID infections and other diseases. A few closing thoughts. Governance and resource management, as we've already heard from the other speakers, and as we all know, are key factors for building of resilience in this region and in others. Yet there are significant gains to be made through appropriate consideration of how climatic influences on different spatial and time scales can interact and combine to impact people's health and well-being, and through convening, as we are here today, to address these considerations. Climate's influence can vary dramatically based on underlying vulnerability. Therefore, many more research is necessary to better evaluate and to characterize the relationship between climatic and socioeconomic, geopolitical, and other important variables, particularly with regard to the methodologies that we use to evaluate these complex, interdependent relationships. Thank you very much, and I look forward to further discussion.
Dr. Kelly, thank you very much for that detailed presentation. I'd now like to invite Professor Jamal Sakir to the floor. He's a professor of practice at the Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill University. Professor Sakir, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody, and greeting from Beirut, Lebanon. Many thanks to Dr. Kelly for his presentation, very comprehensive. I agree with part of it. What I'm going to try to do is try to complement it and add some additional thought for our discussion. Based on my research at McGill as well as the American University of Beirut, I fully agree with the conclusion that climate change is imposing additional pressure on already scarce resources, deepening pre-existing menace connected to water security, but also to land degradation, which is an important aspect to keep in mind. My primary conclusion is all about water security in the region. Water security has been linked for many years to water scarcity. It's not new in the region. The issue happened for centuries. We have seen even some technique, some old technique that we've seen by definition and others in the region to cope with such scarcity. What happened here is climate change is add on to that situation, making it worse. So when we look at it in terms of the data that was presented to us today is an important aspect actually, because what Dr. Kelly is saying is that the drought between 2006 and 2010, which was the worst since 1940, had a direct impact on the economy. For instance, Syrian livestock economy, which was accounted for about 40% of total agricultural production, was severely affected. And overall, agricultural GDP in Syria was contracted by almost 40% between 2011 and 2015, following already a 10% decline in 2010. So the drought continued. That's where you have the 1.5 million of rural population abundant. So we have to be careful about the migration here. I have the 1 million Lebanese, Syrian sitting in Lebanon, but they are not all rural people. So we have to make that nuance important when we talk about the security. But the 1.5 million that abandoned their land, they moved to urban city, and large proportion was already overpopulated, and where violence first erupted in Syria. They formed this franchised belt surrounding Hama, Homs, and Daraa. So in this context, what is missing in the discussion so far is how terrorist groups step in and take advantage of the situation. And let me add to Dr. Kelly's discussion that important aspect. Terrorist organizations like the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, directly or indirectly capitalized on devastation of the drought created by the climate change to attract new members, mainly farmers, mainly rural people, as it happened in several agricultural villages in Syria as well as in Iraq, many of which were successfully taken by ISIS via the recruitment tactic. They were offered life, money, and incentive. These ISIS recruiters, in addition to opening food and money, gave them also option to join other jihadist group. That's why you see the proliferation of terrorism around ISIS, with no means to sustain themselves through agricultural means. So many farmers or rural Syrian accepted ISIS bribe for both monetary and moral support. In fact, if you look at agriculture, it has refused limited attention when we analyze ISIS compared to other sources of ISIS revenue, such as oil, ransom, and various forms of taxation they created. Also, it was an important source for income of ISIS, which in 2014-15 controlled a large part of the breadbasket of Syria and Iraq. What's interesting for us, I know it's not a discussion today, we have seen the similar situation in Darfur. We've seen the similar situation with Boko Haram in Nigeria, where Boko Haram recruited their people around the Lake Chad, tried to recruit them and put them become a terrorist. So the emergence of all of this take us where? While many policymakers, researchers, analysts, and media commentators paint a bleak picture of climate-fueled conflict on an almost incomprehensible scale of the conflict, what I believe it has played a role, but in my opinion, caution must be applied in attributing climate change to conflict, and more empirical evidence are needed. The research of Dr. Coley and others need to be pursued to collect more data and provide us more concise, evidence-based analysis. And I agree with you, Dr. Kelly, that's the important point. Climate change could indeed exacerbate fragile situation, could indeed create social appeal or even violent conflict. But this is related to food security, water security, and migration. However, in my opinion, there is not yet a mono-causal relationship with global warming. Other political and social factors must be considered, and we have to be careful in the discussion. So the conflict of Syria shows us that the impact of climate change more likely served as an early warning. And that's how I put the difference between the other discussion. It's an early warning. Watch it, guys. It's going to happen. It's going to hit you. Therefore, you need to start adaptation. In the Middle East, in particular, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and most of the Middle East countries, it's all about adaptation to climate change. It's not about mitigation. It's not about how to cope with it. We have to adapt. The water scarcity is hitting very hard, and therefore we're going to see much more water security and water climate related issue becoming the security issues in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jamal Sagir and Dr. Colin P. Kelly. I would like to, I'm very aware of the fact that we are fast running out of time, and I know that two of our panelists do have to leave right on time today. So I'm going to get straight into the discussion, the meaty part of today, and that is the panel discussion, Climate Change and Conflict, What Next? It's now time to open up the floor to our panelists, and it's my pleasure to introduce Staffan de Mistura, as a former UN Special Envoy, including in Syria, of course, most recently, and before that in Afghanistan, amongst other places. Welcome to you, Mr. de Mistura. Next, I would like to introduce Ambassador Heinrich Tölken. He's the Director for International Climate and Energy Policy and Digital Transformation in the German Federal Foreign Office and works on digital diplomacy. A warm welcome to you, sir. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Kira Finke. She works at the Potsdam Institute, one of today's hosts, as the project lead of EPIC, the East Africa, Peru, India Climate Capacities. Welcome to you, Dr. Finke. Next is Michael Keating. He's the Executive Director of the European Institute of Peace. Welcome to you. And last but certainly not least, Janani Vivekananda is the Head of Program of the Climate Diplomacy and Security Program at Adelphi. Welcome to you all. I just quickly say that Janani Vivekananda and Ambassador Tölken both need to leave at 4 o'clock. So if they suddenly disappear, do not be surprised. I'll give you my thanks in advance for being on the panel today. So much to take into account. There's so much to respond to. Staffan de Mistura, I'd like to start with you, sir, from your vast experience in or even in Ethiopia as well, but two of the key regions, Afghanistan and Syria. What do you make of what's been said so far, what's been presented? Do you agree with the assessments made today?
Yes, I do. By the way, I'm sorry there is some hard working taking place here, so it may be some noise, but
we can't hear you.
We are used to noise in wars, so this good. Well, first of all, I do agree with everything I heard, particularly on Syria, which I'm more freshly aware of. So I would like to refer to some of it, but come with another angle, so we all contribute, so to speak, and then perhaps touch very quickly on two other places. On Syria, yes, the big debate, you see, and we need to be prepared on discussing this and in a way arguing on this, is whether climate change has caused the conflict or not. This is like everything in Syria or everything everywhere else become politicized. In other words, some people or countries would like to say it was actually done by climate, so it's not caused by other issues. It's not because the policies of Mr. Assad, for instance, or the overreaction to the opposition. So I think it's important when we discuss whether this is the case or not. So let's go back to the points. First of all, facts. 2011, it started, and before it started, between 2004 and 2010, yes, a big drought. And that drought was devastating. More than, probably 900 years, there's never been something like this. So the next point is, were they made any mistakes by the government in order to handle that? Yes, they were. They reduced the actual incentives for the agriculture. They made large irrigation systems, which actually depleted water, which was available and scarce. And that produced, as you heard very well, 1.5 million people were from the rural areas into cities, competing with already scarce jobs. Tensions between Kurds and Arabs increasing potentially, tensions between the Alawite minority and the majority of Sunnis and Arab tribes increasing. And in all this, you had the perfect environment for actually starting the conflict, which was not produced by climate, but by many different elements altogether. Rural poverty, high food prices, water scarcity, migration, competition within the cities, ethnic and religious disparities between Kurds and Arabs, Sunni and Alawites. And the conclusion then was tense, but was produced also by other cocktail of factors. The Arab Spring emulation, the anger against the government policies, the Iran-Saudi Gulf strategic competition, the brutal government repression, the regionalization of the military response. But all this was amplified, yes, multiplied by the climate preparation. In other words, it looks almost as the oil on which fire was put on was the climate deterioration. Now, there is one element which was not touched, is the exploitation of the climate situation, not only the consequences. And here we see that the so-called medieval sieges, the way the conflict has proceeded during my period in particular, when cities were being besieged in a medieval way. Why medieval way? Cutting food and water, medicines. Cutting food to whom? People who were already poor, who didn't have the capacity of buying high expensive food, and therefore were very vulnerable to this temptation by the government to use the medieval sieges in order to actually get them collapsing. That is a new element that we should have seen. In other words, war can be caused or contribute to be caused, a conflict by climate problems, but can be also exploited. Same was the case you heard from Daesh, who exploited the poverty of the area. You heard it very well from Dr. Jamal, and then used it with high salaries. Al-Nusra did the same in order to recruit fighters. Bottom line, climate was not the cause of the conflict. I agree. And probably it's not the case in many other places. Probably never totally the only cause, but an amplifier, the fire on which you can put, or the oil on which you can put fire, definitely. Last point, On Lebanon, we had the same problem when I was there on the Litani River, when there was competition between Lebanon and Israel about the use. And when the water went down, tension came up and the UN had to intervene. In Afghanistan, the poppy production, for instance, can be or could be affected by climate. That means less revenues for the Taliban. Or the Taliban attack more often during the summer or the spring. If the winter gets closer, shorter and less winterish, you will have more attacks, which has been the case even during winter. And last but not least, Ethiopia. You said it. I had myself was in Ethiopia in 1984 when we had the major drought which caused Tigray and Wollo, the opportunity for Mengistu to actually try to repress the revolt by increasing the hunger in the area. You can see that this connectivity between the two sides has been a constant. We need to focus on making sure the people, especially now, when we have a new US administration and therefore very open for integrated strategic approach between conflict and environment, that we can actually see this connectivity and not fall into the tendency to simply say it's all caused by climate. At the same time, climate is an amplifier, a multiplier, and is being exploited by everyone who wants to have a conflict. I will stop there.
All right, thank you indeed, Stefan de Mistura, for that very cohesive tying together of what we've been talking about today. That will bring me to my next question, then perhaps moving from the understanding that the two issues are so inextricably linked and bring us to the response. And I might turn to you for that, Ambassador Tolkien, in terms of these are complex issues, the climate change impacts on conflict calls for a very well coordinated response. As we've heard, it is not the only cause of these conflicts, but it has a lot to do with exacerbating them. Has the idea of a whole of government approach, as it were, taken root in the international community? You may want to speak particularly from the German perspective, but other countries as well.
Yes, I do think so. I come from the climate background, not so much from the conflict background, and we have been working hard to get the voices of the climate community and those who think that this is a risk multiplier actually driving conflict. We have been trying hard to get our arguments heard by the security community and also by the community that's dealing with development cooperation and humanitarian assistance. And I think we have reached a good point in the meantime. At least in the federal government, we see that this mainstreaming, as we call it, of climate change and security implications is taking root. And we see, for example, that more and more we see on country contexts that there is a joint analysis and a joint programming underway that includes factors like climate change, resource management, resource competition, and so on, just as was so ably mentioned by all the speakers before. We also work hard on guidelines for our crisis engagement within the federal government that will also look at the matter. But I think we are really reaching a point on a national level, certainly. What I'm concerned about is that on an international level, we see that there's still a kind of distance between the security community and the climate community. And we have experienced this when we tried to get the subject of climate security into the Security Council of the United Nations. We saw that 1/3 of the members, at least in the meeting last July in 2020, was against having a resolution that really clearly delineates the link between the two factors. When the British held their debate just only this week, the scenery looked much different because now the yes is on board. The United States has said, yes, it is an important factor. And we felt that the whole narrative has changed to the positive ever since. So we look forward to the Security Council continuously looking at the matter and seeing the link and taking action.
All right, thank you. Now, Janani Vivekananda, I wanted to come to you next, actually. But before I do, I'm just going to pick up on something that Ambassador Tolkien said there and turn to you, Dr. Kira Finke, excuse me, from the Potsdam Institute to ask you, on that, the idea of the sort of the siloing of funding these projects. Scientists and peace builders have for a long time worked quite separately. And that's partly what we're here today to discuss, how we can better come together in these projects. Where do you think that we can and should coordinate better, and what obstacles remain, and how can we overcome those?
Thank you for the question. I think there's a variety of topics that one can collaborate on. And this kind of goes back to things that have been already mentioned, such as environmental peace building, climate sensitive mediation, and also streaming those initiatives into the already ongoing climate adaptation programs. I think it also is required that we train our civilian peacekeepers as well as our military forces more on climate change impacts, because when I look at where, for example, the German military is active currently in places such as Afghanistan, there are already very significant climate impacts occurring. And I think it's very important to connect the dots and to enable people to know about these changes and what risks they pose to both livelihoods and human security. A point that maybe has not been mentioned so strongly is to look at what countries that are successfully mediating conflicts of interests over scarce resources, as instruments to balance these interests. And one important factor are crop yield loss insurances. When I worked in Burkina Faso and Ethiopia, you can see that even a modest loss of crop yield losses can lead to extreme hunger, can lead to devastation of communities, meaning that people may be forced to migrate out. They may be more inclined to join armed groups in order to feed their families, actually. So for this reason, it's very important to look at the human security framework in this context, and really streamline both civilian measures as well as military measures here. And one aspect I wanted to introduce is also the thought of reconstruction. So if we look at, for example, Syria and Afghanistan, even before all violence ends, there's already money being investigated into reconstruction measures. And we need to consider climate change in this already. And this is something that the peace building community and the climate community can work on together. Both in terms of physical infrastructure, how do we build cities again that are climate proof, that don't emit massive amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. These are things that we now have to consider, just as we are considering statics and other issues when we're reconstructing. As well as the more softer parts. So for example, when it comes to educational system, university systems, many countries we talked about today do not have a master's degree program in climate physics. So they are not able to assess these risks themselves, but rely on foreign institutes such as ourselves for them to make such projections. And this kind of curtails their independence in a sense.
All right, thank you for that. Now I'm going to pivot to Janana Vivekananda, because I know that you have to leave us shortly as well. And I have a question prepared that's come into us actually, and I'm going to pose it to you. It's from Stefan Dion, the Ambassador of Canada to Germany and Special Envoy to the European Union. And he's asked, what kind of data do policymakers need to understand and respond to climate-related displacement?
Thanks very much, Rebecca, and thanks, Stefan, for that question. It's a great question. I mean, we've heard a lot about the why from our excellent regional expositions, and also about the what and the where, but I think the data question is really important. But I think it's not just about data, but what we do with it. So I think I'd like to also not just talk about the data that we need, but the how, the how we're going to use it. And there, I think there are three things that are important. On data, I think it's about the type of assessments that we're doing, but I also think there's a lot to be said about awareness and also about incentives. And I think these three things are vital to help us actually move from acknowledgement to action, to move from where we are in the research and analysis bubble to actually walk the talk. So when it comes to awareness, I think everyone in this virtual room, we all accept that climate change poses these risks to peace and security. These risks are very real and present. And as Professor Edenhofer noted, we've come a long way in the past decade in having other actors see this too. But the fact is that many still don't really know about this critical relationship across other sectors, or they might be vaguely aware of it and accept it in principle, but they can't really see how it relates to them. So we might get better and better data, but it's not helpful unless we can connect it to those people that needs to become cognizant of the issue and have the requisite buy-in to actually do something about it. And it's clear to us that climate-related security risks fall across all these different sectors and institutional mandates, and that this then calls for these different sectors, development, humanitarian actors, peace builders, to better understand how these risks can affect their work. But we're really far from getting these actors to go beyond kind of giving the topic a gentle nod of acknowledgement to actually knowing what to do about it, i.e. what tools and processes there are within their remits that can be used to assess these risks and address them. So here I think, again, it's not just about more and better data, but about kind of being able to translate that into the kind of information that practitioners need. So I think building awareness is a key and core priority. And this awareness raising needs to be specific to the audience we need to reach. And communication is really important here. I think it's just as important as the data. People don't pay heed to things they don't understand. So we can give them really, really good research, but if they don't understand how we got there, it's not going to resonate. This applies to everyone, but especially to time-stressed policymakers and field staff on the front line. If I don't give you information that resonates with your priorities, that speaks your language, that is to say, uses the concepts and the terms and the kind of frameworks of your sector, you're not going to engage. So I think we need to offer an overarching narrative which resonates with the different audiences we're trying to reach, that helps convey how these seemingly kind of abstract or amorphous or far away risks actually play out, but also what specifically the different audiences can do about this. And there, I think the second point around assessments is really important. Imagine we get the narrative right and we have people's attention. We can only address these risks better on the ground if we have a better understanding of how exactly they'll play out in a given context. So there, yes, we definitely do need better risk assessment. It needs to be locally informed, multifaceted, making use of the best available climate science. And I'm delighted that we at Adelphi are partnering with PIC and our colleagues at Berghof to, as part of Weathering Risk, to draw on their respective climate change and conflict expertise to better advance climate security risk and foresight assessment. And I think the foresight part is really important here, because the future doesn't look like the past. So we need to just be not only looking backwards and using historical data, but also using forward-looking models. But it's not just about research and analysis. It's not just about more data. It's also about research and analysis, which is policy and practitioner relevant. We often hear about how policy needs to be informed by science. I think that's why many of us are here. But I would also stress that science needs to be informed by policy. That's to say, we have a responsibility to ensure that the evidence being produced, the data that we're collecting, that we're feeding into the system, is answering the questions that policymakers need answers to in order to make them or help them make climate security risk-informed decisions. So again, comms is key. We need to make sure this information is offered in a way which our target audiences, be they policymakers or practitioners on the front line, can understand. Integrated assessment models with complex graphs and multivariate modeling results are great for robust research, but they're not effective ways to get people to do something differently on the ground, when what we're asked to give them are, say, 3 specific entry points for development programming in central Mali, for example. So we need to ensure that enough is invested in this translation function of specific institutions that can bridge the science, policy, and practitioner divide. And I think partnerships like these that we're seeing here today between Berghof, PIC, Adelphi, and these multi-partner approaches of projects like Weathering Risk are very much steps in the right direction. But then the third issue is still another gap, I think, and this is really important, and that's incentives. We know we need better coordination across different sectors. We know we need all relevant actors to make use of, to actually do and make use of better analysis of climate security risks. And we know we need these risks to be reflected in every aspect of decision making and reporting. And we know we need strong leadership, but knowing it and wanting it won't get us there. And I think we need to be pragmatic about cold, hard incentives that need to be put in place, and we can see how it works. So if we think about the ask to desk officers in a particular regional bureau, for example, and we're asking them to do and use climate security risk analysis approaches, various tools and methods exist, but everyone's busy doing things as they usually do them, and they barely have time. We all barely have time to respond to our emails, let alone doing anything extra. And to do a climate security risk assessment is an additional task. To integrate the findings of an assessment like this into their programming is an additional task. It's unlikely to be done on kind of for its moral and intellectual value, even if there's goodwill, even if there's buy-in. And so this ask needs to be institutionalized. I think this means really concrete things, kind of integrate the need to do a climate security risk assessment as part of your key performance indicators within HR systems. You won't progress professionally unless you show you've effectively integrated climate security into your programming or in your program design and your M&E, for example.
Janani, I'm just going to jump in there. That's fascinating. You brought up some really, really good points, and I could see Stefan de Mistura and Ambassador Token both nodding away there in agreement. And just while you're still here and with us, and while Ambassador Token's still here and with us, before we quickly get to some, before I get to Michael Keating and obviously some Q&A questions, I just wanted to give Stefan de Mistura and Ambassador Token the floor if they wanted to respond to anything you say. I could see some notes being written there and some thumbs up. So if you had anything that you wanted to respond, please do so now.
No, I think what I heard, I agreed with, and I spoke enough, and I made my point. Perhaps one last little point. I really want to congratulate Berghof and Andrew Gilmore for this initiative. The timing is perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you allow, I'd just like to comment on one of the key sentences that Janani just made. I mean, everything she said is absolutely right, and I fully agree. But the key sentence that policymaking needs to be informed by scientific evidence, but science also needs to be informed by policymaking. I think this is really key, because sometimes we in the policymaking business are confronted with scientific evidence that is overwhelming us. We cannot digest it, and it's not properly packaged and addressed to us. And I think we should all strive very hard to make the connection between science and policymaking as smooth and as efficient as possible. And I think whether in risk, I have high expectations that we get information, we get evidence from there that can directly feed into policymaking on climate change and security. I think this is really key. Otherwise, I'm perfectly happy with what you said.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, Michael Keating, I will now turn to you. Last year, you, as a part of the European Institute for Peace, interviewed seasoned mediators on what it means to bring peace in a climate changed world. I wanted to ask you about the key findings, but I also wanted to touch on what resistance there might be amongst the peace building community at a local or international level about the relevance of climate and environment and its effect on power sharing.
Well, thank you. Let me just begin by congratulating the Potsdam Institute and Berghof for organizing this, and the attendance is extraordinary. And I think there have been a number of very compelling presentations, a very, very rich discussion. So I'm absolutely delighted to be given the honor of talking to you all. You know, it seems to me that there is no question now that the understanding of how climate change and environmental degradation is exacerbating tensions, that is a given. I think there's also a lot of conversation about how this knowledge can contribute to peace building and maybe to conflict prevention in the kind of countries where organizations like the Institute of Peace works and many of you works. But I guess, you know, to your point, the question we've asked ourselves, and I like Janani's, you know, question, policymakers need help to answer the questions they are posing. And the question we are posing is, does an understanding of climate change, environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, and so on? Can it help with peacemaking, which is not the same as conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and peace building, although it's intimately linked with them? And as you say, we've done an initial kind of stab at answering that question, and I may ask one of my colleagues to post that. I have to say, from my experience in Somalia, as I was the UN envoy there till a couple of years ago, and the question is undoubtedly answered in the positive in the following sense. I mean, clearly disputes over resources such as water and land lend themselves to, peacemaking skills. But when it comes to hardcore political issues like security sector reform, like governance, like the relationship between the central government and regional governments, when it comes to dealing with insurgencies, do these things help? And in Somalia, one of the things that we did is try and enrich one of the central political problems, which was the power struggle between the central government and the federal member states, by introducing other topics of conversation which didn't necessarily, resolve the fundamental political problems, but it put them into a context which then made discussion about some of the hardcore political issues possibly slightly easier. So that's one thing, one point I would make. But Andrew's clear instructions were to stick to Afghanistan. So let me just throw a few ideas out on Afghanistan. And I would say that in answer to the, I don't have an answer to the question I put out there, but we're right now in the middle of a very delicate, complicated peace process with talks taking place in Doha, with an architecture being put together, with regional actors on board or not on board. And it seems to me the question I would have is, does an understanding of climate and environment have a role in trying to move these things forward? And I don't have a precise answer, but it would seem to me that even though the hardcore issues in Doha, for example, are about the nature of government, they're about security sector reform, they're about ceasefires and so on, there also needs to be a discussion about the basis upon which development assistance can continue, how the state can continue to function, and indeed what short-term assistance will be immediately needed in the event of a peace agreement. And bringing this kind of conversation into the negotiations is going to be tough, because clearly the agenda has to be agreed between the parties, but it could contribute to changing or enriching some of the dynamics. The second point, I'm only going to make 3 points. The second point is related to that. Peace agreements tend not to work unless they are backed by an investment package, a very serious investment package. You see this in Northern Ireland, you see it in Colombia, you see it all over the world. And clearly an understanding of climate and environment and biodiversity loss needs to inform what kind of investment package that is. Whether it's relating to repair, some obvious things on the basis of the presentations we've been given about repairing local infrastructure, wells and dams and reforestation, but also things like if there's going to be disengagement zones or demilitarized zones, what can we do in those that would be useful? Then there's the issue of what do you do about demilitarized competence? Is there a scope for linking, activities that relate to building forward better to specific hardcore political issues that need to be addressed if you're going to right-size the security forces and so on? The third point I would make, I think has been amply made by others, is the regional dimension. The peace agreement in Afghanistan is not going to work unless regional actors feel seriously invested in the success of these talks. And right now, with apologies to others who may know more than I do, but the quality of that conversation is very uneven and very lacking as much coherence as it needs. If that conversation was, why does the region need a peace agreement, and why is it in the interests of the regional and major powers to incentivize the parties to invest in these talks, because they're going to benefit from them in ways that have been set out, including socioeconomic and water and drugs and so on. That could also be incredibly helpful. So I don't have a precise answer to the question I've posed, but I think there's much more scope for looking at how an understanding of climate and environmental degradation can contribute to the resolution of really tough political issues, which does not mean it's the answer to all of them, because they have plenty of other origins and so on, but we have not done enough to understand and invest in this space. Thank you. Can't hear you.
I promised I wouldn't do that again. Anyway, thank you, Michael Keating, for that very robust response. Really appreciate it. I know that Dr. Kira Finke has something that she would like to comment on what you've just said. So I'll hand the floor over to her. Dr. Finke, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just a quick comment on your last point of regional integration. I think you're very much right, and especially with regards to regional integration of Afghanistan, more also to their Central Asian partners, because as we see, both climate change and also the reconstruction of Afghanistan may put further stress on water resources. Afghanistan is currently, because of the ongoing conflict, underusing, so to say, its water resources. So I think it's key to foster regional integration with Central Asian neighbors in order to guarantee stability in the future. I would also like to comment on the issue of data and whether science should follow policymaking or vice versa. I think we have to be aware that conflicts and underdevelopment very strongly restrain our ability to project climate change. So for example, if you have a country where there has been ongoing civil war over the past decades or just periods of interruption, this often goes along with disruption in the maintenance of weather stations. This may be of least concern of peace builders in the region, but it has long-term consequences, because when you do climate projections, you rely on very good weather station data. And in some cases, this is available, but in many cases, it is not. And this is, for example, why we don't know as much about the high Central Asia, to which also Afghanistan belongs, as we would like to. So, of course, science should follow policy relevance also. But it also needs to stay to the ground and stay close to the truth. And this is what we have seen in the COVID-19 crisis as well. And maybe just one last word on that regard. We've seen in the current crisis that the pandemic overwhelmed capacities of even industrialized countries. And that nonlinear changes, nonlinear rising damages can overwhelm our capacities, and that adaptation then will just be a catch-up game, and we will not be able to keep up with the rising damages. And this means we really have to invest in prevention. And this is difficult because prevention and as well as science, it's very difficult to communicate its advantages, because successful prevention often results in the maintenance of the status quo, and that's not easily to be communicated as a huge success. And in the case of climate change, of course, this means mitigation, and I just want to mention this because it has not been mentioned, and this is not the focus of our discussion today. But mitigation also includes, of course, mitigation in the defense sector and its complete decarbonization. I think this is something that is of relevance today as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Finke. We're fast running out of time, but I'm going to try and get at least one question in from the audience, and I'll touch it. It does touch on mitigation. It is open to the whole panel, so I'll do that quickly before everyone who has to leave has to leave. And the question is from Christoph Bogner. I hope I've got that correctly. I'm sorry. And it's, how can climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies include a conflict-sensitive design to avoid that these interventions have unintended negative impacts? Just pop your hand up if you would like to go first. Perhaps that's the easiest way to do it. And by my hand, I mean this, not the fancy Zoom function hand. Would anyone like to speak to that? Yep, your microphone is on, Stefan.
Did I understand clearly the question? You said that, the question was, again, can you say it please again?
Yes. How can climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies include a conflict-sensitive design to avoid these interventions having unintended negative impacts? Okay,
first of all, yes, the answer is ideally, the first conclusion we should all suggest to those who prepare a strategy in conflict mitigation is to include the aspect of climate, either before, during, and certainly in the project of reconstruction rehabilitation. Second, I cannot see any unwanted damage, frankly, because the problem is just the opposite. We don't pay enough attention to climate. Last point, if we want to look at it from a marketing point of view, advocacy, since climate is the issue, we can exploit, like the bad guys exploit the climate in order to make life terrible during conflict. We should exploit a little bit more this new sensitivity in order to draw attention on the urgency and the doability of preventing conflict. So I don't see any problem there. We just need to be creative and positive and propositive on this. Climate has always been a sideshow, something to take into consideration later. Sorry, I will give it to the director. Sorry, my floor.
No, not at all. Thank you very much. But I will turn to Ambassador Tolkien because you were waving as well and you have something to say.
Yeah.
So go for it.
Thank you. I mean, it's absolutely right. Just as well as climate change can cause, let's say, conflict and tension, also can adaptation and mitigation measures. We must be aware of this. So if we tell, let's say, a pastoralist, you cannot be here and hurt your cattle or your whatever your animals here because we have to take care of biodiversity because water is scarce here. This is, of course, let's say, infringing on their traditional ways of doing business and running their own agricultural needs. So we need to be very much aware of the context that we are acting within, both with mitigation and adaptation. We have to look around. What are the social conditions here? What are the economic conditions? How are people making their livelihoods? And then really tailor-make a measure that fits into the context that we are acting in. Thank you.
Reasonable.
Thank you to you both. Does anyone else want to say anything on that? I will try and squeeze one more question. Okay, Dr. Finke, unmute your mic. Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I think one answer to this could be also to really put people in the center of environmental protection. And I think this is something where the human security aspect comes in. I saw in Bangladesh, this is more an environmental issue, people approaching me, asking me why we, whoever that was, maybe a European aid agency, are protecting the tigers but not helping the people. And it's a very, very difficult question to answer when you're on the ground talking to people who are seeing funds being allocated to a much needed environmental protection, but which may mean for them that they're not allowed to go into the forest and harvest wood or something like this for their survival. So I think it's always important to create very context-specific projects that take into account the local realities and that put people at the center of these endeavors, because this is actually why most people are also in climate science. It's because they care about the future of humans. They don't only care about the environment, but they care about our common future as a human family.
Thank you. I might try and squeeze one more question. I know we have people with very tight schedules. Would you mind if I just ask one quick more audience question, and then we'll just see if you have to leave, and we'll understand. So this one comes from Camille Marquette, and she asks, can you please elaborate on the place of gender, not only in the analysis of climate conflict links, but in the response we can bring to these combined challenges? I didn't hear all that much on gender, so I thought it was an important one to perhaps reflect on briefly.
Maybe I can
lost there the ambassador. So thank you, Ambassador, for joining the conversation. Dr. Finke or would you like to speak now? I know that Janani Vivekananda also has to leave. Did you have something that you would like to say on this? Maybe you could speak first.
No, I'm afraid I do need to leave.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone.
All right, then you have the floor, Dr. Finke.
Thank you, and thank you, Janani. Yeah, I think too often women are only looked at in the context of vulnerabilities and of being victims of climate change. It is clear that women are often disproportionately affected, and we need also more research on this. I think it's an important factor. However, we should also acknowledge the role of women as peace builders, of active members of communities which can mediate conflicts, which often also naturally inhabit these roles. And we need to invest in their education, in their training, in order for them to really take on this role and become leaders in their respective communities and become leaders of adaptation and mitigation and such. So I think there needs to be more attention to the empowerment of women and not only to their respective vulnerability.
All right, thank you. Stefan, Mr. please, you can unmute your microphone. We just need you to unmute, sir. You can just unmute your microphone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I fully support what we heard. Totally right. Look at Afghanistan these days. The Taliban discussions and negotiations. The whole issue is about the role of women, or at least a major test case is about the role of women. Even in Syria, we had it. They are by far more reasonable. They don't just take a position based on ideological positions. They know what the people need. They are crucial and they are often excluded. Now, that means also on the issue about environment. So I fully support that. In fact, we should have mentioned it, but we were so much taken by the full focus on environment that we did. But by the way, let me raise my pen. This is a campaign we have been launching with many, including UNESCO, about the fact that one Afghan woman has been asking all of us if we can raise our pen. Others are raising their Kalashnikov. We should be raising their pen on their behalf. Women in Afghanistan, after the Taliban agreement with the government, should be given the same right they have now. Education, education, education. So that's why I'm raising my pen.
Well, we'll raise our pens together.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. There are so many questions that we have had to leave unanswered. So obviously we can't address all of them, but hopefully that's a signal that the discussion is going to continue and go way beyond today. I want to thank all of our speakers, in particular, the two who've been able to remain past the 4 o'clock deadline. I also want to thank all of the speakers who we've heard from today, and of course the Berghof Foundation and the Potsdam Institute as well. And lastly, but not leastly, many thanks to everyone who was able to be here for your contributions, for the questions, even the ones that went unanswered. And we really appreciate your time and your interest in this topic. And apologies again, we weren't able to get to more of your questions. That, ladies and gentlemen, concludes this discussion for today on the conflict and climate debate. We look forward to seeing you at a future event soon. Thank you very much.